Can we cut ourselves off from the people and still remain scientists? The battle to measure the heavens is won by doubt. By credulity, the Roman housewife's battle for milk will be lost again and again. Science, Artie, is involved in both struggles. What are you scientists working for? The sole aim of science, to my mind, is to lighten the toil of a human existence. If you give way to coercion, your progress must be a progress away from humanity. The gulf between you and humanity might grow so wide that the response to your exaltation at some new achievement could be a universal howl of horror. As a scientist, I had a unique opportunity. In my day, astronomy emerged into the marketplace. At that particular time, if one man had put up a fight, it might have had vast repercussions. I've come to the conclusion, Sati, that I was never in real danger. For a time, I was as strong as the authorities, and I surrendered my knowledge to the powers that be to use it, not use it, abuse it, just as they saw fit.
Welcome to What's Left, a weekly political discussion challenging the mainstream left. We are online at what'sleftpodcast.com. You can find the link to our blog in the episode notes. Please subscribe, rate, review, turn on your notifications, share your favorite episode, or jot down our information wherever you found this episode. My name is Andy Libson. I'm a socialist and teacher here in Oakland. We're joined by Kenny Zepeda, who's also a socialist. And as you can see, we have, Eduardo's not here today. And we have two guests I want to introduce. One is George Borg, visiting assistant professor of philosophy at UPenn. And the other is Vincent Kelley, PhD candidate in musicology at UPenn. So first off, welcome, George, and welcome, Vincent.
Thanks for having me on.
So let me explain to our guests and our audience what we're doing today. First off, George reached out to me, I think, about a month or two ago, I think you had seen a What's Left episode. What was the What's Left episode about? Do you remember?
Yes, it was about it was a discussion of an article on the lockdown left by Chris Parenti. So this is an episode from a while ago, I think maybe beginning of early 2022, if memory serves. It's what it sounded like. Where Parenti is criticizing most of the left, including the radical left, for supporting the COVID regime narrative. And I stumbled onto it kind of by accident, and I thought the whole line of questioning was pretty much consonant with mine, and so then I followed the links to in the podcast notes there so the podcast is connected with this group called the Workers and Students for Choice, sort of left medical freedom group, and I just signed up, put myself on the mailing list for that, and then Andy reached out to me, and that's how we got the ball rolling.
Yeah, and I think you were kind of glad to find other not just explicit leftists, but even Marxists who might have taken a critical view of what's going on and tried to fight what was going on about this. And I remember you saying that. And so, both myself and George are Marxists, and that was great to meet a person who also was a Marxist, who wasn't crazy and thinking that the state should be, supported in mandating things, and wasn't supporting big pharma in injecting people with things. So that was nice.
I would say I was actually, I was excited, right? Because until then, I had been in a socialist organization, which had been, DSA, and which had been completely on board with the COVID regime, or at least quietistic about it. And I knew of very few explicit Marxists who were challenging the narrative in any deep way. And so none in this country. I was excited to find out about you guys.
And you had mentioned this, that yourself and Vincent had tried to do some organizing against mandates, which we'll talk about later, a few years back. And now I've published a recent article opposing any new imposition of mandates and things like that, as well as the past ones. But I think that the interesting discussion, the conversation we had went just deeper than Marxism. It got into science. And you, George, have a background in the philosophy and history of science. And you had deeper questions about what's going on with science, just like has happened here. And I was like, okay, let's have that discussion here. And you said your friend Vincent here might also be interested in joining us in that discussion, would be helpful. Maybe what I'll do now, so this, folks, is what the discussion is going to be about. It's going to be about science and truth and trying to figure out what the hell's going on in the world, not just politically, but in an area that many of us thought was almost free of politics, and somehow or was moving closer to the truth, because we knew politics were lies. I think several of us would agree with that. But this over here there was some truth, and I think that balloon has been punctured for all of us, and so we're trying to take it from there. Vincent, maybe introduce yourself and say anything you want to, and George as well, about yourself or what you hope to discuss today.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you for having us on, both of us. And, I'm really glad to have found out about your podcast and work through George, because he stumbled upon it. Then I was able to benefit secondhand from that as well. I can get into this a little bit more later, but essentially some of that background that you gave as far as how our world has really been shaken up over the last 3 years has really made me reflect on a lot of the place of science and technology, especially on the left, as somebody who does have a background on the left and maybe is less of a card-carrying leftist than some these days, just because of my own personal political trajectory. But I think a lot of the analysis coming out of Marxism and the left movement in general, it was just very confusing to me how a lot of people were responding to the pandemic. And I think I've just gotten more disillusioned with a lot of the responses the more that we've actually learned about the motives behind them and things that really only time can tell. So, I'm hoping we can get into some of that today. And I will say, I'm far less qualified to speak on some of these issues of philosophy and history of science compared to somebody like George. But, my own background is more in actually religious studies and music studies and things like that. But I'm kind of a wannabe philosopher of sorts. So I appreciate the opportunity to intervene in some of these discussions in the ways that I can.
Well, science is the new religion, Vincent. So religious studies might come in useful.
Yeah, and in terms of, I think Kenny would agree with this, but in terms of qualified, honestly, I think this whole notion of qualifications is wrong, and it's been used to keep people silent. And actually, one of the first things we have to open up is that the people most qualified to speak on this are the people affected by these things. And I think, George, you sent me a quote from Galileo, that movie Galileo, that I think I will use to open this discussion, where, this is supposed to be for us. So, and not just something that's handed down, but is literally ours. So I think everyone is qualified to speak on these issues. Unfortunately, except many of the experts who have a stake in something else other than finding the truth. So I think that framework I'm firmed up more in my head than when we first started What's Left.
Yeah, I think part of the appeal of science. So in that Galileo quote from that movie, right? He links the struggle for scientific truth against the church in his time, right, and the geocentric view of the universe they were supporting, with the class struggle, right? And he talks about how the struggle of the peasants against the landlords, right, in early modern Italy, is organically connected with the struggle of the scientists for truth, right? In his case, because the geocentric worldview was being used to as part of the ideology for keeping the peasants down and extracting surplus labor from them.
And Kenny, you were going to say something?
I just wanted to comment on that, the whole credentials and things. I've been very vocal on the show about my disdain for, I get triggered by the word expert now, because I've seen it used on war. That was always obvious, right? Like some general goes on national TV to explain weapons of mass destruction, and the need to go and invade a country. And I see that same thing, right, with like the scientists that objectively push a lot of this pseudoscience, right, like that we now understand and have evidence for, that it was a complete lie, when it comes to the pandemic, right, and all these mandates and restrictions. And so just wanted to add that I in the process of going through the pandemic and resisting a lot of the mandates, I learned and I reaffirmed the notion that I would rather listen to my mother than a lot of college educated people. Because, we've talked about education, because what is the role of education in society, and especially in the context of capitalism and these institutions of institutionalizing people. And so, again, just wanted to drop that in, that, we think everyone has something to say. And often I find, especially in this journey, that the people that have the less documented credentials often were closer to the truth than at least in my experience being in San Francisco, where everyone was vicious against the unvaccinated. And, San Francisco being one of the most educated, regions in the world, quote unquote.
I mean, I think part of the appeal of science for the ruling class is precisely that it's opaque. You're right. And so every day, the problems of everyday life can sort of get recoded in these terms that only, the experts can understand, right? And then that gives the experts and the people they work for a tremendous amount of power over the working class. And we see like the failure, as you were like, from experience that, like the masking and all that stuff is a joke, right? It doesn't work. It's just something that's being imposed on you by the supposed experts and really the people that they're working for. Yeah.
And
Go ahead, Ken.
And then, funny you mentioned this obscure terminology and language, right? And that's exactly what the church did, with using Latin in many countries, right, where only the priests could access the scripture and all this stuff. And so, yes, it just brings back this notion that science, or modern Western science, is the new religion of many.
And I'll say, in a reading that we never actually brought to What's Left, but I think we did, where Rosa Luxemburg was writing about economics, she made the same claim about economics, that it obscures much more. In fact, it seems to be developed to obscure the way the economy runs rather than reveal it. So I think there's a lot of that. So Vincent, how would you describe where you were and where you are and how you got there with regards to science and your thoughts about it?
Well, I think probably the best thing to do is actually go pretty far back in my personal history before just the beginning of the pandemic or things like that, because I do think the overarching, arc of someone's biography does matter in a lot of ways for where people ended up going into this and where they ended up, right now. So, one interesting thing we were talking a little bit about before the podcast was the relationship between science and education. And for me, I had somewhat of an unconventional educational background. I was mostly homeschooled, but I went to public school for some classes. I didn't get a high school diploma. I took the GED and then went to college with that. But it was an interesting experience for me. And, there's always the temptation of telling, as philosophers like to call it, just so stories about your past. But, I do feel like I had some window into the function of schooling in society, just not being totally a part of it, but also partaking in it to some degree. And that definitely made me more skeptical of a lot of the dogmas that were just being handed down, especially in things, like this is what science says or something like that, or how you learn this assemblage of facts that's just, taken as self-justifying. And fast forwarding from that a little bit, I'm from the Pacific Northwest in Oregon, and, the left out there, I don't know if you guys have discussed some of the regional differences, but, there's definitely, more of the sort of radical environmental side of things out there, just much more present than some of the more organized socialist or communist parties, or, even larger scale labor movement or things like that. And some of my early politicization was in the radical environmental movement. And I think a lot of that imbued me with just an intuition to be somewhat skeptical about a lot of scientific claims that were being made as this only way that one could know about the world. And I think hopefully we can get into this issue of knowing versus manipulating the world, which I think is an important one. But, this idea that I think I got pretty early on, that, manipulation might not be the best direction to go, and that where is really the dividing line between knowing the truth about a phenomenon and just being able to practically manipulate it for certain ends. And then again, the connection there between where does science end and technology start. I think they're often partitioned a lot in mainstream discussions and debate about this, as if they can be tidily put into their own corners. But I think with the pandemic, we definitely saw that, at least from my perspective, the two are very much intertwined, and a lot of scientists who are ostensibly engaged in the dispassionate search for truth are very much invested in a certain technocratic worldview, and a certain way of manipulating the world towards certain ends that is not in the interests of workers or the people in general. So, some of my background, I think, primed me to be a bit skeptical of a lot of claims that ended up being made during the pandemic. However, I think, and I'm really curious what you all have to say about this, but, after being involved in some of the radical environmental politics, I ended up getting pretty disillusioned with that. And a lot of it was actually coming to India, where I'm living right now for some of my research work. But the first time I came was, I guess it's been 9 years now. But, I realized, living in a major city in South Asia, that a lot of the talking points, if you will, that were being made by radical environmentalists, though they might be correct analytically or factually, were not really going to resonate with the broad masses of people on a global level. There just wasn't a sort of connection there. And I think, thinking about implementing some of those ideas in a city like Delhi, for example, felt very far flung to me, and definitely drew me more towards labor politics as just the major thing that needed to be focused on. So, that brought me more into, I guess, what you might consider the more traditional left, if you will. And, was involved with some different socialist and communist organizing. And without going into too much detail with that, I think it was very beneficial in many ways. But on the question of science, I think it actually set me back a bit leading up to the pandemic, because I think, as you've discussed, I believe in some of the previous episodes of What's Left, a lot of the left coming from that perspective does just see science as somehow separate from all of these other things that are politicized, and that you can kind of just trust the experts and let them do their thing, and then we do our thing. And then, after there is a major shift in political economy or social relations, there can somehow be this fluid transformation of science into something that is actually for the people, as some people will discuss it. And so I think a lot of my intuitive skepticism around science as a privileged method for knowing and changing the world was really sidelined to some degree when I was involved with some of these leftist engagements. And I think that really did set me back at the beginning of the pandemic, because I was still involved with one of these groups at that time. And I think, some left groups opposed the COVID mandates to some degree, but, I think, those that were a little bit more on an unconventional side of things, but I think the reasons also matter why one's opposing them too, right? So it shouldn't just be, and this is my critique of the right on a lot of this stuff as well, is, it's not just, okay, Joe Biden told me to wear a mask, so I'm not going to wear one. I mean, I don't think that's really the level of analysis that we need. Maybe it's a good intuition, right? And there can be some fertile ground for discussion there. But, there isn't always anywhere, there usually isn't somewhere to go when people are just, being dissidents for dissidents' sake. And there's not really a broader analysis there. So, I think for me, I was, when I eventually came out against the mandates at Penn quite publicly, and this is how I ended up meeting George later on, with a petition against the, in this case, booster mandate. We can get into the decision-making allocations around the original vaccine mandates that were citywide, and then the booster that the universities were implementing. But in any case, just because of my position on that, and previously on some other issues that just, didn't really jive with the general leftist takes on things, I found myself more in dialogue with people on the right. A lot of times, at least when I would write things, that would be more of the audience. Even if you're not choosing that, I think a lot of us, I see some of you nodding a lot about this, have had that experience, especially during the pandemic. So I think we have seen a massive political realignment happen before our eyes. And, one of the things that I've been trying to do is just understand, like you said at the beginning of the podcast, what is actually going on right now, because it does feel like history has moved very quickly. Even with certain recent events in global affairs, I think there's other realignments happening right now that have to be analyzed. But I can get more into the details of my approach to some of these mandates and the pandemic in general. But I think that's a long-winded enough of an intro right now, so I can probably hand it over to George, unless you all have specific questions you want to ask.
Yeah. I do want to say this, because I think you use the word science is trying to reveal something versus science as about manipulation. And that I realized that when you first said that word, I was like, yeah, science is manipulating people. But science has also been about manipulating the environment, right? And so that term you're using I imagine you're using in both ways. The ability to manipulate our environment, which really is the raison d'etre around science and things about that, particularly when Marxists talk about science. But it clearly it has become much more about manipulating people than about manipulating the environment and shaping the environment. And is that the way you meant it at the time? Because it came up both ways for me.
Yeah, I think both ways. I definitely, when I was using it in terms of some of the radical environmental analysis of this stuff, I think that was a way in which that kind of movement has been a little bit ahead of a lot of the at least mainstream Marxists on this, and kind of thinking about both sides of the coin on that kind of issue of both the environment and people. And I think during the pandemic response, we definitely witnessed the manipulation of people in a major way that I think a lot of people who had an analysis even of manipulation of the environment were unprepared to actually grapple with intellectually and politically. And I think it's been really important to meet some people who have actually understood that is a necessary task. Even if we don't have all the tools to do it, we at least need to move in that direction.
I mean, I think that the whole environmentalist side of this thing is also a place of many questions, because there are narratives there too that have to be questioned, that are taken as a given, on the left, just like climate change, and what does that mean, and so yeah, it's very interesting that that's where you had your start, because I have very we even had an episode here of where we discussed Planet of the Apes, Planet of the Humans, and there was someone who was part of that documentary who we interviewed and disowned us because we were questioning the vaccine mandates. And so, again, it shows the cognitive, what do you call that? Sorry.
Dissonance?
Dissonance, yeah. Many, and it's not to shame people, right? It's not to to say we are morally or more intellectually righteous, right? But it does show the ability of the systems that we're fighting in executing this manipulation and division. Because now recently with Lewontin, people on the freedom movement, that are not all leftists. There's a lot of people who lean right, who oppose the vaccine mandates. But now we things about Israel, for example, and not seeing, after having in-depth discussions about the fourth industrial revolution, digital, currencies, geofencing, and a dystopian future where we are more precisely controlled. Even after all those discussions, there's people who fail to see, Palestinians as being in that world that we are trying to prevent, from going to. And so I think that to me is a big lesson here, that regardless of the topic, where we think there is an objective science, we have to question the mainstream narratives, because often all I think we find is that we ourselves are control opposition, that we think we are radical, but we actually might be doing the bidding and falling right into the hands of the people who rule this world.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more on that, Kenny. I think, it's hard to ignore the current events in Palestine right now. And I know that's not the topic for today, but I think, I've been very troubled by a lot of the response to this from those who have opposed vaccine mandates more from the right. And I think it in other related things like you were talking about, where you feel like, okay, there's a certain amount of unity forged here that we can move forward with, and then something happens objectively in the world, and there's a realization that maybe that unity wasn't from as it appeared to be. And I think that was definitely something I've been thinking about recently. And I think it's a major lesson for how, real good faith discussion and struggle over these issues can never end. I mean, we can't be complacent just because it feels emotionally good to be in unity with somebody because you're opposed to whatever the mainstream position is at any given time. I think it's very easy, just to fall into that trap of being satisfied. And I think we have to resist that at all costs.
Yeah. George, what about you? How would you mark your transformation from where you were to where you are?
Yeah, so in some ways I was starting off from, if Vincent's background made him prone to a bit more skepticism, mine, ironically enough, made me less prone, even though you would think it would have made me more prone. And the reason is that I have a science background, so I trained in chemistry, and I was basically in that field for a while, 12 years, like all together, all told. And I, besides academic chemistry, I also worked in the biotech industry. So in theory, like I should probably have been more suspicious, but actually, I think it made me less because, in particular, after being in the pharmaceutical industry, it wasn't there for very long, but for a few years, right? And you just, and already sort of veering towards Marxism at that time, so had some insight into the profit motive and the effects of that on pharmaceutical production, right? But on the other hand, there's a lot of ideological indoctrination in the sciences as well, right? I mean, you're trained to be skeptical about like your precise field, right? But then that's sort of combined with a sort of basically science worship, right? And so there, plus also scientists have material interests, right? That also give them, disincline them from being skeptical of certain kinds of science-based narratives, because that's where they get their money from. I mean, like practically every organic chemistry article, at least when I was in the business, starts off with some justification in terms of medicinal development. So that they'll do some incredibly abstruse exercise in the lab that if it ever helps anybody is extremely unlikely, right? But they'll still justify it and get funding for it just by saying that, well, we can envision eventually developing anti-malarials or whatever, cancer drugs or whatever, through doing these studies, right? So they have their material. And in the top chemistry departments, like any professor who's like sort of kind of moving up, right, and ambitious, will start partnerships with companies, get on the board of directors of various startups, will start their own companies, right, through obviously partnerships with venture capital. They're also heavily indebted to state agencies like the National Cancer Institute, the National Health Institute, the National Science Foundation, and all of those agencies see it as their mission to promote American business, and in particular, pharmaceuticals and the chemical industry and so on. So both ideologically and materially, there's a lot of pressure on scientists not to be critical in a sort of holistic sense, right? In terms of what exactly is, who are they benefiting in the at the end of the day. And then, the university, being in the university milieu also for a long time, because of various career movements, does not help. You would think it would help, but it actually did not in my case, because the universities are very hierarchical. A lot of people outside of academia don't, I think, appreciate exactly how hierarchical universities are. Not, there's a lot of this semblance of collegiality, but in fact it's a very much top down. People are used to taking orders. There's a cult of the expert, right? And because these are all experts in training, right? And even somebody in, like doing abstruse stuff in philosophy, right, in metaphysics or something, or medieval French literature or something, musicology perhaps. They're all thought to think of themselves as to worship expertise, right? And so you don't, as one expert, you don't question. There's this ideological disincentive to question the work of other experts, and everybody's got their turf, right? And you sort of you don't question what other people are doing, right? Unless they're in your field. And then finally, I mean, the left, the response to the left was quite disappointing. I would say that was the single, like when I get sort of mad about the pandemic, so that's one of the things that makes me the maddest. That there's a scientific tradition in the socialist left, right? I mean, after all, we're supposed to be scientific socialists, right? So, and there's this, sort of admiration throughout the Marxist tradition, starting, Marx himself wanted, he started scientific socialism, and there's this tradition of, respecting, of wanting to get at the truth and using, sort of rigorous scientific means to get at it. But I think that's been very much sort of corrupted, and like it's just turned into a sort of worship of institutional science, right, and the science of the bourgeoisie. And it's still like kind of amazing to me. Like I was in like Marxist study groups. We were reading all the classics, and as soon as the CDC and the public health authorities and the political authorities started telling us that we all had to stay 6 feet apart, wear masks, couldn't go outside, ruined our life, we had to ruin our lives or help them do it. They all went along with it, right? And it's like, what was the point of reading Marx, Engels, Lenin, and then just there was this myopia on the radical left here that I still sort of wonder how that could have happened to the extent that it did. So that's so those were, and then of course I was, subject to the same propaganda as everybody else, in the media and stuff. So those were, I mean, you asked me, I think about my ideological progression. So I had to overcome those sort of obstacles having, from my trajectory. And the way, did you want me to talk about?
Keep going, yeah.
And it helped, for me, like, again, because I was sort of was brought up in these various ways to have a lot of respect for science. What helped me was seeing other, dissident scientists questioning the orthodox science. And that sort of got me thinking, well, maybe there's some, serious reasons for thinking there's something wrong with with this narrative. And so, plus also being the target of the vaccine mandates helped a lot. When they're starting to put your job on the line for it, that helps.
Yeah, I mean, I've mentioned this before, but Lynn Margolis, who was came symbiogenesis, a theory about how evolution might not have occurred in a slow way, but happened in a rapid way, and was criticized for that theory. she said that being a scientist is being a radical, and I really agree with that. She also didn't believe the HIV theories of HIV being connected to AIDS, and was critical of that notion. So she practiced what she preached in terms of being able to kind of look more deeply into what the institution of science is doing versus what her own pursuit was taking. And I think this probably actually is where we're probably going to move more into discussion area. But the thing that you raised, George, about publishing, because that's my background too. And I remember everything I published, and my first thing I published was about a protein staphylococcal nuclease, where we had gotten the protein structure for it, and staph nuclease is able to cleave DNA molecules very specifically. And the thing that got me even in, like, I was trained as a chemist, or got my degree in chemistry in college, but I didn't really become fascinated with pursuing it until I learned about biochemistry and these things like proteins and DNA and RNA. And specifically with proteins, really, that made me interested. The idea that there were these giant molecules that could catalyze very specific chemistry without producing side products and things like that, because my mom was an organic chemist, an inorganic chemist actually, and I knew that every time they did a reaction, you got some of the product you wanted, but you got a lot of what you didn't want. And that these molecules, the notion that there's these giant molecules that can, make 99.99% of the reaction go one way, and not produce a bunch of side products, was fascinating to me. And so my reason for being interested in this was like, I was just interested in how this stuff worked. It wasn't to produce something for a pharmaceutical company. It wasn't to produce something for a drug or something like that. And in fact, my first graduate project was to look at the structure of a giant protein that was doing very specific chemistry on DNA, make a single mutation in it, and then see how that affected its ability to do that. It's to really just learn, like, how does this thing work? And yet, in order to justify it, I had to basically kiss the ring of the pharmaceutical industry. And I really think there's a way that is pernicious on so many levels. First, I had to justify my work not on the basis of my own curiosity, but on the basis of something that helps some industry or build something else. And it conditioned me to pay fealty, almost kiss the ring of this industry that I have no interest in. And I feel like from the jump, the minute I got into science, it got me away from what my reason for getting into science was, which was just fucking curiosity. And that, to me, like, just you bringing up that art, reminding me of my own experience in just publishing, was meaningful.
Yeah, a lot of people start off that way. And I think there was a time when academic chemistry and academic science in general was, more of a sort of academic, disinterested, pursuit of knowledge. But they've become incredibly intertwined with capital by this point. I mean, even the focus, since you're a chemist, even the focus on synthesis, even if you're just doing it out of curiosity, how do we make this compound, perhaps enzymatically, perhaps completely artificially. Even that, some people would argue, reflects the needs of the chemical industry, because there was a time when chemists were more interested in, like, classifying natural substances, that they would find in plants and fungi and whatnot, and studying how those substances transform, react and get transformed into into other substances in the natural environment, right? But since about, I don't know, mid 20th century, maybe a bit earlier, the whole chemistry as a whole has become really focused on developing better methods for making chemicals, and some would argue largely because of the needs of capital.
For me, it just it brings up this whole when you, George, describe your experience in your fields and in how much of a lane is constructed for each person participating, and I think, at least for me, that explains a bit of why something like the pandemic was able to happen. Like the narratives, why were they so successful? because these lanes are so restricted. And makes me think of the quote by Michael Parenti and Rosa Luxemburg. They say something similar about a leash on your neck, right? Like if you don't steer away from the peg, you will never feel the tug of the leash on your neck. And for many of us, this was the pandemic was the first time where that tug was really strong and like threatening and like it was present. Then it brings up, right, the question about education and what is education about in a capitalist society, and does that mean freedom, right? Because there isn't many avenues, at least from what I see, to explore truly the thing that you care about. We don't live in that society because your material reality is dependent, or you participating in this system. And I know there is plenty of people who, with sort of expertise, doctors, nurses, who stayed quiet, during this time, or were opposing in a silent manner. They didn't have the courage, and again, to each their own. Everyone has to come to their own self-reflection as to why they didn't say anything, or why they chose not to. I'm not gonna put it on everyone, but I know for a fact that many people stay silent. It's not that they didn't know; they were silent participants in something so horrible, right? And then I have to bring it back to Israel, right? Like it's one of the most highly educated places in the world, and yet there is this system of classic oppression, right? Like, because I think that the oppression that we faced during the pandemic maybe doesn't hit the psychology of many people. They don't associate it with being similar, in consequence to what Palestinians are going through. So I don't know if you have any thoughts or comments on this.
Yeah, I mean, I think the other thing that's come up in terms of, I think all of us kind of are leftists, come from a left background. And I want to put this out there as a possible, I've been thinking about this for many years in terms of Marxism and science. Marx talked about the possibility of socialism being realizable was in part based on the idea that its theory of revolution was rooted in science, was rooted in materialism, and rooted in the production of an actual class of people who could make a revolution. That was the working class. And instead of just saying, well, I have this idea and that idea, like Fourier and Owen, Charles Owen, and other socialists who had ideas about how society would be, Marx said, no, what is actually existing in the world that could make a revolution? And that was supposedly a scientific approach. And the notion that the working class was the revolutionary agent of change was a theoretical consequence of his scientific kind of pursuit, or scientific discovery, kind of, not discovery, of what was unearthed scientifically out of his the way he looked at things. But there was a second part that always emerged for us. At least this was discussed among the socialists that I was organizing with, which was, it wasn't just the production of the working class or the existence of the working class that made revolution possible, but it was what the efficiency and all that science had produced around it that had made production such an efficient process, so that workers would have time to actually democratically discuss. Workers wouldn't be so belabored and beleaguered under the onus of capitalism. So there was that second half that kind of said, if you take that away from us, if you take that technology that had made the possibility of efficient production away from us, well, then the possibility of revolution tanks. And personally, that was a notion that existed among socialists and exists among socialists. And I think it made us kind of say, you can't take capitalist science away from us, because if you do, the possibility of revolution goes away. Because I feel like there were two prongs to our possibility: the existence of the working class, but also the existence of all this wonderful stuff that would make our life easier, as if that's what it was attempting to do. So I think Marxists got trapped in this notion of, no, revolution isn't just an act of the working class itself, but it's possible by virtue of all these things that capitalism has produced, particularly the things that are a result of its science. And so I feel like we half went and said revolution is not possible if science is not what it is. And I feel like it made us dependent and become as dedicated to pursuing the aims of working class revolution, but it became subordinated almost to saying, but it has to be with science still there, with all its tools and things it's produced, because if we don't have that, then the whole project is over. Which I think I question that now. But I feel like that framework is what put me in a position, not just my science background, like George is talking about. And I do think, like Vincent's homeschooling environment made him much more likely to question things. My background, like George's, made me much more likely to be just a robot. Fortunately, I don't think I'm a robot, and I got out of it. But I think there was also a Marxist training to becoming a robot, and I would root it in that, in terms of science. Capitalist science is making revolution possible, almost.
So I guess maybe this can we can sort of connect this back with the idea of science as religion, in that we're sort of so the idea of science as religion involves what we talked about, the sort of opacity of science, right? And translating everyday problems into these sort of terms that nobody except the experts understand. But there's also another aspect, right, which is that science is apolitical, right? That's how it can be a replacement for religion. Because just as religions are supposed to sort of stand above, social relations between people, right? So science is, in other words, above politics. So science is supposed to be apolitical, right? And perhaps what's going on there, right, is that people Marxists have not sufficiently appreciated that is a semblance, right? That actually science in a class society is going to be politicized, right? And it just gives the appearance of being apolitical. And so people who just focus on, the use of science to create more productive machinery, right, are kind of being misled by certain uses of science, right, that don't seem apolitical but really aren't, right? So obviously, in that particular case, right, the capitalists use the more efficient machinery, right, to exploit workers more, right? This is what this plays a key role in what Marx called the production of relative surplus value. But I think we can go sort of a bit further, right? So I highly recommend to your viewers a book called Biology as Ideology by Richard Lewontin. Where I think that's a very, very good starting point for sort of thinking about science in Marxist terms, right? And so but it also has some limitations. So he basically says that science has two functions, right? It has a manipulation function, which is basically allowing us to manipulate and control the natural world, right? And then it also has an explanatory function, right, where science allows us to explain the natural world, not just do things with it, right? And in fact, you can do a lot of things with science that don't have a ready explanation, right? So you don't always need theory, in other words, to do things on nature. And Lewontin gives a number of examples of that. And so the explanatory function can be used for legitimation of the existing society, right, according to Lewontin. So for the example he uses is that of reductionism, right? Explaining everything in terms of, say, genes, right? So and so the problems faced by individuals are explained in terms of their genes, right? The problems faced by society, poverty, crime, whatnot, are explained in terms of the actions of individuals, right? So it's bourgeois science is individualistic in that its explanations take the individual as their starting point. So there's this contrast between manipulation and explanation, but which is a very valuable one, right? But I think manipulation is also he tends to understate the role of manipulation in supporting capitalism, right? And so, in other words, doing things to nature, right? And so we see things like the pandemic is a spectacular example of this, right? You have these things that were developed for very carefully controlled, laboratory or clinical environments, right? Or within those environments, like masks, PCR tests, vaccines, right? And then suddenly our whole social world is transformed by those things, right? So the and so then science can become a means of social control, right? So had vaccine passes, forcing people to mask, to not interact with each other in person, right? So this is this you could say that the pandemic was a spectacular example of sort of exporting the lab out into society, right? And transforming our society by this sort of extension of the lab outside of its the normal boundaries of the lab, right? So I think that like though Lewontin provides a useful starting point, right? And I think and a lot of Marxists would start from ideology, right? There's more going on with science than just sort of making useful things, and and then this sort of ideology getting overlaid on it, right? The useful things are actually weapons, right? Marx in fact calls the machine, a weapon of the capitalist against the worker, and I think that goes, but that goes outside that goes way beyond just the factory, right? And the vaccine is a weapon for controlling people. The masks are weapons for controlling people. It's not just that there's this sort of bullshit explanation, sort of overlaid on their use. They are, the science is a tool in the hands of the the ruling class.
I think I'm just expanding on what you just said, but or rephrasing. So yeah, science is not this purely objective thing that's just standing there, right? Someone controls it, and someone shapes its intent, to manipulate in whichever way. And I think that's the biggest failure that we have currently. That I notice in environmentalist groups and in people advocating for health and all this stuff. For safety, based on this purely objective thing that's not touched by or is slightly touched, because I think a lot of people have failed to see that weaponization of the CDC, for example, right, and how the CDC is just a mirror image of the weapons manufacturing industry. That cycle, right, of people coming in and out, from the CDC to pharmaceuticals and back and around, is no different than people coming from the State Department to Raytheon or Boeing and all these companies.
Yeah, but I don't think it's just a matter of regulatory capture, though I think that's definitely like really important. Because people who focus on regulatory capture, including like some Marxists who like focus on the role of monopoly capital and sort of distorting the functions of the FDA and whatnot, but it's very important too. But I don't think this is just about if you want to understand the role of science and sort of the power of science in our society, it's not just that monopoly capital or whatever corporations are causing drugs to be produced badly, right? Because they want to do shortcuts and whatnot. It's also that science is being used to kind of just transform how people are interacting, right? So let me give you another example beyond the things that everybody knows, like masks and vaccines, right? During the pandemic, right, class struggle became redefined in scientific, or I should say, pseudo-scientific terms, right? So now all of a sudden, because the unions, for at least the ones for the most part, went along with the COVID narrative, right, COVID regime narrative, suddenly their bargaining chip is arguing with employers over, PPE. Some of them even were howling for vaccine mandates. Right, this happened at Pitt. I was actually in a union campaign before I left there to do my postdoc in Philly. And almost the last day of the campaign, we had just won the election without any democratic debate. The campaign movement called for vaccine mandates, right? Luckily, I mean, I was on my way out, so I wasn't affected by that, right? So, but the point is beyond, the opportunism of all that. The point is that the class struggle there, the workplace, was redefined in these sort of scientific terms, where now we're arguing about vaccines and safety protocols rather than about increasing wages, about maybe a bit more democratic participation in the workplace, restrictions on firing and the like, right? So it goes, the use of, that's not just an ideological use of science. The ideology is obviously playing a role, in that, right? And clearly the manipulation of the natural world there is going beyond just making use values. It's actually now people are appropriating that, the unions, the employers, and using that manipulative technology that's developed in the lab to remold the class struggle.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's coming to mind for me with this discussion is, we're talking a lot about class struggle and class analysis and, what we even mean by different classes. So I do think one of the strengths of Marxism is this analysis of the petty bourgeoisie as this mediating class. And I think, we've been talking about scientific labor and education and these themes. And I think one of the common threads there is this petty bourgeois class strata that plays this really significant role in sort of mediating between workers and the ruling class. And I think specifically on the ideological front, it's just so pivotal on questions of science. So, one of the things I found very perplexing, I think there is an explanation for it. I'll try to offer one, but, is just how certain so many of these people, like you mentioned, Kenny, just the highly educated islands within American society or in Israel or wherever, how certain they were in expert opinion or consensus or whatever you want to call it around a lot of these policies during the pandemic. And, including people who themselves are not actually in those fields, but there's this sort of deference to those people in those fields. And I think some of this is this forging of social unity within the petty bourgeoisie, where you sort of get this almost psychological wage, if you will, of kind of being in that class, of being kind of the chosen interpreters of experts, who may not be the people you actually associate with on a daily basis in your workplace environment, but because of your educational background, having gone to college, and now increasingly a lot of people having done advanced degrees who are taking a leading role in translating this kind of thing to people. There's very much this. I think it feels very good. It's a very typical kind of petty bourgeois approach where, everything kind of becomes about the self, and sort of this affective affinity with other people in this no man's land between the major poles of class struggle. I was thinking about this a little before. I don't know, is it all right if I just read something really quickly? Because I was, thinking about the topic that you all had proposed for this and was revisiting some of my notes. And there's one economic historian I had come across through reading David Noble's work on technology, and her name is Maxine Berg. And one of the interesting perspectives here, I think, is on how all of this played out at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, which I see some major parallels with the current political moment if we're thinking about realignments within society. So, some of this discussion is, early 19th century when the Luddite movement is prominent, and, how different political tendencies in England were responding to that. So she talks about how within both the Tory party and conservatives and within the working class movement, there were differing perspectives on the question of machinery and technology. So on the one hand, you have these Owenite utopian kind of socialists who, almost venerate the machine, but then you actually have workers themselves who have a much more direct confrontation, as George was mentioning. And then she also talks about how within this sort of Tory party, there were more of the people who saw this inevitable element of technology where, maybe we don't like it, but it's just going to happen. But then in the more rural areas, there was actually this resistance to it. And so interestingly enough, she observes how there was this convergence of certain radical working class activity with certain elements within the Tories. So I'll just read one thing here that I pulled up. And this relates, the reason I want to bring it up here is I think it relates to this segmentation of classes and what the role of the middle class or petty bourgeoisie actually is within times of decisive political struggle. So just quoting here, she says, middle class economic and political perspectives actively eulogize the progress of science and technology, but challenged on both sides by Tory and radical working class opinion, the middle class had to find an explanation for the economic and social impact of the machine. Expressions of wonder at the technical perfection of the machine were not adequate. It was thus that the middle class took to itself a, quote, scientific theory, political economy. This theory was expected to provide answers by employers, politicians, and middle-class ideologists. It was no mere coincidence that industrialization and the emergence of political economy occurred at virtually the same time. And this is basically in the very late 18th century, early 19th century. So, I guess getting back to this question of, even why are there elements within Marxism that have given this robotic training, or however you had put it, Andy? And I think, the idea before Marx of something like social science or political economy as specifically a scientific enterprise, and obviously Marx makes major critiques of classical political economy while at the same time upholding certain insights. But I think looking at it from more of a historical perspective, what is the role of science as sort of justifying something as inevitable, right? So in this case, the burgeoning middle class is venerating technology, but not everybody's going to buy that. I mean, even in today's world, not everybody buys that. Not everybody is buying that. Especially when you get out of these enclaves of the professional managerial class. So there have to be other justifications. And I think what we saw a lot was, especially since science has also been diversified demographically a lot in recent decades, there was this idea of people going to working class communities that they have come from and sort of educating their people, as it were, and what the correct science was on these things. And I think, this is sort of a concession that, yeah, people realize a lot of people realize their families coming from particular neighborhoods or particular backgrounds are not going to be all about science and technology and, eulogizing whatever the next new thing is. People are just skeptical. So, you can't get people to have that intuitive response all the time. But then the idea is you come in with just the science, which can't be questioned. And I think, this particular kind of, I guess coming back to, maybe this relates back to the explanation versus manipulation thing, and maybe on more of the explanation side, but this idea of sort of, we are going to explain to you what the reality is and you have to accept it, I think is still happening. It's just so interesting for me to read this, history of early capitalism where, there were different, ideologies mustered to sort of justify things that just weren't popular with a lot of segments of society.
No, I think that quote is pretty amazing. Who did you say wrote it again? Oh, you're muted.
Sorry, Maxine Berg.
Yeah, and I agree with you that it really resonates. You're saying that was 18. What is she speaking about? What period?
She's talking about, I think, like the 1790s into the early 19th century. Yeah.
Yeah, and I absolutely agree that process that's underway then, when there was opposition to what was happening, which has now been obscured. It's like that those folks have already been run over. The Luddites have already been defeated, if you will. The world that needed to be made, not on behalf of workers, but on behalf of the capitalists, was able to be made. But it didn't get made without some segment of the working class saying, we don't want to go there. That's not going to help us. And in fact, we wanted to go in a different direction. And so you did need a group of people. I would say a managerial class, a justifying class, an academic class that would, because capitalist trained managers are never as good as the managers that come out of the working class, right? And in fact, in education, there's this idea of like, oh, that principal used to be a teacher. They're going to be a better principal. And in fact, it's only better for the ruling class because those people know how to speak. They know how to talk to the worker in a way that they might get them to trust this process that is actually antithetical to what the work they're actually doing. Because ultimately, a manager is there to just be the angels for the God that is the capitalist, right? To send the message down of what needs to happen. And I think in a similar way, where George is talking about how unions bought into this new moment where it's electronic and digital and separated. We had our largest union meetings under Zoom, right? And our union leaders were saying, "Oh my God, look at this! We have 500 people at this meeting, but we were all on fucking Zoom boxes." And it's like, already then I was like, "Oh my God, this is not good," because the entire medium is controlled by our enemy. Like, I mean, there's nothing we can do that was free here except to be 500 boxes. And it's true. At our normal in-person meetings, we were good if we got 100 sometimes, and people thought just because we had more that we now had more unity, but we were more separated. We were more controlled. The medium was more, what a union meeting under Zoom, there's no better way of talking about something that has absolutely no possibility of producing an outcome that could harm the capitalists than a union meeting in Zoom, because the whole structure is owned and controlled by the capitalist class. And in fact, what would happen is some people would start to put questions in the chat because they were not happy with what was going on, and then they had to move the Zoom meetings so that you wouldn't have chat anymore, you wouldn't have that, and so literally the only people who would talk are the people who are the squares that you saw who were given the ability to have the voices, and the 497 other people just have to shut the fuck up while they just listen to these people talk. And so it is you can literally see how class struggle was being channeled through their mechanisms, using their technology, and at the same time being promoted as something that could actually lead to greater struggle. as opposed to destroying working class struggle, let alone the notion of we need our schools to go remote to keep us safe and things like that, which again are going to be the basis by which, ultimately our jobs are eradicated by the data collection that's going to produce AI that's going to replace teachers. And so the same process is underway, and the same class of justifiers for that, and people who are going to tell you lies and sweet lies to make you think that your sense that something dire is happening is not true. That you're actually, oh no, this could work, this can be better for us, and like that. It's that petty bourgeoisie that is trained and asked to play that role.
Yeah, and let's not forget that scientists are basically petty bourgeois, right? I mean, they're not capitalists. They don't own the means of production. They are sort of an intermediate layer, right, between the capitalists and the working class, right? Yeah, and I mean it's interesting, right? So it sounds like, Vincent, like you're sort of focusing on this role of the petty bourgeoisie and the labor aristocracy, right, in control, like using science to control the broader working class, right? And so it's interesting thinking about this because it seems like science kind of gives a certain autonomy and power to the petty bourgeoisie and labor aristocracy vis-a-vis the working class, but also vis-a-vis capital, right? So like this thing about workplace struggles being redefined in terms of safety protocols and vaccine mandates and whatnot. I mean, obviously they're being dupes, right? But they are at the same time using this to wangle concessions out of their employers. They're just sort of the wrong kinds of concessions, right? It's basically petty bourgeois opportunism, right? So the labor aristocracy is going to say, the leaders of the unions, right, are going to say, oh, we can use the COVID narrative to extract concessions out of the boss, and it makes us look good because we're like fighting for the safety of our members, right? So it was used very opportunistic. The science gets used very opportunistically as a weapon in class struggle, right? So I guess that's what I mean by I agree that there's a huge ideological component, but it's not just that, right? The science is actually getting used and materially forced into the workplace as through this sort of perverted class struggle is what I would call it, something like that.
Well, there's no escape, right? I think that's the big thing. It's just like you said, the movement of the laboratory into broader society. But I think this is again where education is the model, right? I don't think it's a coincidence that the penetration of the school into the home, for example, through Zoom classes, also aligned with the penetration of all of these new biotechnologies into every facet of life as a prerequisite for engaging in society in many ways. And I think it always is justified in terms of inclusivity, for example, the idea that we're going to be able to educate more people by putting everything online, right? Oh, we're going to save on transport costs for poor families, or it's going to be greener because people don't have to travel, or whatever the justification may be. And I think, fortunately, I think on the education one, at least a lot of parents have rejected that incursion. I mean, there has been a major uptick in homeschooling across pretty wide swaths of the population, I think, in response to, a lot of parents seeing what's actually going on in these classes, or, how much value there is in just, like you said, having 500 Zoom boxes on a screen and calling that education, just like people are calling the union movement some kind of political struggle when that's happening. but yeah, that was just some of the things that I was thinking about.
Something that came up for me was when you're talking about the petty bourgeois, I also think about Marxism, right? And these ideas and notions of class struggle and how they've also been pushed to managed by that class, because a lot of these conversations are happening in near or in academic settings, right? And for me, it's really important, like us right here, right? Like I have a degree of college education. All of you obviously have, degrees of education, and but this conversation, right? Like it's good to shape our individual ideas, but they have to move into the masses, right? Like we have to be in conversation with people who we interact with, right? Because like we talked about, we understand that we're participating in a medium that we don't control. Like this can be taken down. Or we have been taken down before. We've been censored. They can manipulate this to use this against us at some point in our lives, right? Like, and so the real work, right, like comes from, for me, talking to my mom, to my partner, to my brother, to my friends, in ways that is understandable and also not patronizing, right? Like not me becoming that manager. Like it's a reciprocal thing because, like I mentioned before, my mother was the first one who said, "Are you fucking serious? This came from a bat." The whole COVID narrative. My mother, she has high school, education, and she's an immigrant, and she's seen as someone ignorant, right? Or like in terms of in relation to people in San Francisco, for example, who have master's degrees in biotech and all this bullshit, and but my mother knew from the beginning, I do not believe this, and she's engaged in a struggle at work, for better wages, and she's going through that battle. And so I have these conversations, and I'm still learning to have a conversation with her but in deconstructing my own bullshit that I learned in UC Berkeley, and to really be, a comrade, versus someone who's also a manager of this knowledge that we're discussing, right? Because we have to understand, right, that to some degree we are all control opposition. And we have to be watchful for that stuff, right? In order to fight these mechanisms that we're still deconstructing. Because for me, COVID was the beginning. Like I thought I was a Marxist before. I thought I was a socialist. I thought I understood. But here I am again, like learning again in how efficient these mechanisms are. That the people who rule us, they're not stupid, and we have to understand that, because I also, like, I listened to Garland Nixon, Scott Ritter, Jimmy Dore, Kim Iverson, and all these people, right? And they are part of the petty, bourgeoisie, and they still have this arrogance of calling the people who rule us stupid, or that somehow they're mismanaging situations when we are losing the war, when we are so crushed, when we are so easily divided, with the next issue. And so for me, it's important to have that understanding that we have these conversations and they're important to be had. And, and we have to fight the people who are in their own islands, and to try to build something. But ultimately it has to come back to the reality of our situation, right? And not theoretical, and so what struggle do we carry out, and it's hard. It's not easy. I don't have the answers. We don't have the answers, but we think that having these conversations is of great importance, right? In order to be exposed to things things that we are blind to, right? Like so yeah, just some thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I think the lack of working class militancy has also been an important part of what allowed the pandemic, and actually even like the Ukraine war, and the sort of more increasingly like histrionic responses of our political class to things that crop up. has been a big part of that. I mean, because there was a time, at least in some parts of the West, where you had these, big communist parties that, were at least like critical of the society as a whole, right? At least, I mean, they eventually all got bought off. But anyway, like there's no like counter movement that's prominent, that is truly working class, and that is there, to criticize every feature of the ruling class system, right? So then you don't get, so then when the CDC says, X, everybody just sort of goes along and believes it. I also, I mean, I one thing I worry about a lot is how to connect people like us to people like your mother, right? That was the original aspiration of Marxism, right? That you would fuse the socialist intellectuals with the working class that was actually in a position to bring about socialism. That seems to have, that link has been more or less completely severed since the end of the Cold War.
Well, I think I'm going to take in some ways where Kenny left off, and George, the question you said, because let me do this first. I'm getting this book out to you. George will recognize it, right? Late Capitalism by what was it? Where does it say? Ernest Mandel. So why do I have this book, which I haven't opened yet? But it's because when George reached out to me, he sent me a quote from one of the chapters in this book, chapter 14, which really resonated with him about Ernest Mandel's description of late capitalism as being very similar to some of the things that are going on today. And I was like, wow, I could see those parallels. So it made me like, I feel like I need to start from the beginning of this book and see.
That book was from the early 70s, just for
okay. Yeah. And yeah, right. He was talking about that in not the 70s, but, and then Vincent, of course, you shared that quote from the woman you had mentioned about the period of the end of the 18th century. So for me, what's left, I thought of initially what's left as like, almost like the way people think about, get more subscribers, get more people that you're talking to, and you can have maybe more influence and maybe more connections and things like that. But this whole process has changed my view on that. For me, it literally is the conversation I'm having with George or with Vincent, and certainly with Kenny and Eduardo and Hema and Jessica and also some of the guests we've had. It's just whatever connection I can make there that causes me to think. And then at that point, it's about my wife, Brandy, listens to these episodes. My mom listens to these episodes. My brother listens to these episodes. Brian listens to these episodes. I have a colleague at work who listens to these episodes. And from there, discussions start happening about, and they say what they agree with and they say what they disagree with. And for me, that's where all the action is. Like, it's not whether we get to 1,000 or 10,000 or 100,000 subscribers. As much as I still get caught up, I can get caught in that. It really is what from these discussions moves somebody else to begin a conversation about what's going on in the world. How do we enter into that? How could we change it? And so I think we do have a connection to Kenny's mom through Kenny, and so I'm not going to, I mean, I know I've met your mom before, Kenny, but I'm not going to be the person having that conversation. Kenny's having it. And that conversation is a tighter one now than it was in the past, where you were going on to Berkeley and you were thinking that she didn't know some stuff. And she was thinking, well, my son, he's so educated, I should listen to him, but sometimes he seems like he's full of shit, But now you are closer, even if you can disagree more coherently now, right? You can, and that's true for me and my mom and my brother. Like, our disagreements are actually more productive now. And so that to me is like a reminder of, it's like the Luddites remind us, like, what do we need? What do we need to survive? And this vehicle really is just about me connecting with people to help me hear different ideas about the things that are going on, so that I can bring them into my community. And I think that's where that will go. I don't know. Will that be enough? It doesn't seem like it, but it's the only thing I know, because I believe this entire like the thing you were saying, George, that literally everything we make under capitalism is not a tool to help us, but a tool to enslave us, is never become more clear than the production of the tools that are being made now during the Fourth Industrial Revolution. Like all those tools are tools of slavery, and ultimately of trying to capture us and break us up. So I go back and think that it is going to be me, and it's going to be touching. It's going to be physical contact. It's going to be people I'm in actual in the same vicinity as, and what we do is going to matter. Not just this mass, diverse, dispersed, I don't know, digital whatever. I don't know if that makes sense, but I lost it a little bit. But that's what's coming to my mind as a result of this discussion right now.
Yeah, I guess I would, if I had to describe what you were saying, it sounds like you're describing sort of the subjective conditions, right? You get into the subjective versus objective distinction, right? And of Marxism. So it sounds like what you're describing are the subjective conditions for eventual class formation, or formation of the revolutionary class consciousness, right? I have no quarrel with that. A lot of my questions these days have more to do with the objective conditions, and are, in Marx's time, and even well into the 20th century, there was the manufacturing base, right? That was the real proletariat, right? That was providing the objective conditions for a socialist revolution. And I guess what my questions now are the objective conditions there, right? And where exactly are we at in the development of the economy, right? Are we at a point that's going to permit the formation of a revolutionary class, or because all the ideology in the world, right? There's all the proselytizing, talking, conversations, and whatnot, which are all very good things, right? All the podcasts aren't going to help if the objective conditions aren't there, right? And so maybe this idea of a fourth IR, or whatever theory that can help us figure out, whether the conditions are ripe or not for the formation of revolutionary class consciousness.
Henny?
It's just worth another conversation, but yeah, I don't know. We've in the past we've talked about like our optimism, right, for revolution, and I think Libsyn, you and I are both less optimistic, right, because of these of the conditions, I would say, in the systems that are coming into play right now, and how separated we are. And as much as these conversations are important, and we've talked about on this show that we are fighting for humanity, right? Not like humans as a whole, but like our own humanity, and to stay connected with other people. And I think we in other shows, you mentioned the family, right? And we talked about how like the people we're in close relationship with, our reality, right? We I don't think we address that too much, right? Like what's real, what's not, but we know that our family, our people, that's real, and what they're going through, like their struggles in this world, is what pushes me to, push for the struggle. That's my struggle right now. Right now, I'm no longer an activist. I'm no longer a community organizer in San Francisco. My struggle is my family and trying to stay afloat. And that's what I know. Those are my conditions. And the struggle is real. The shit is getting harder. We're getting squeezed more, and we know that there is more attacks coming. Right, the COVID wave was an attack, and how do we survive that? A lot of my people, my friends, have been financially, economically decimated. We've been separated, so that to me is my reality, that we have to contend with, and in that reality, it's so hard to even have these conversations. I have such a hard time reading now because I'm working like an animal, trying to provide for my kid. And so it's hard. We have to keep going and find a way, like it's been hard for other people. And it's just, I guess, important to have perspective. And that perspective comes from me, from the people I'm close with and that I interact with. Yeah.
Vincent, any thoughts?
Just one thing that really stood out to me in what you just said, Kenny, is how we think about fighting for humanity, not necessarily just as this abstraction, but something very concrete. And this has been a major concern of mine recently, as far as the ethics of these mandates and everything else that's being done, is what is the actual scale that we're thinking about, or anyone is thinking about, when they want to do good or make a change or something like that. And I do think there's something about the human being that has been lost in this very abstracted vision of humanity that's promoted by the public health establishment and others. And maybe this is another discussion that we can have in the future at some point, because I'm very curious to hear all of your views on this. But especially those of us coming from a left background, how to attend to the individual human being in a way that's not individualistic, if you will. And that's been a major preoccupation of mine recently. And I think what you were talking about, as far as the sphere of who you're working with, right? I can imagine a lot of, leftists who have kind of, absorbed all the talking points, describing that as some kind of retreat, or, postmodern defeat into, some smaller sphere or something like that. And I think, it's hard to argue with people like that unless they really have experienced what you were talking about earlier with, feeling the leash, if you will, in these larger scale organizations, or more grandiose rhetoric around some form of abstracted humanity, rather than the human beings that you're actually in contact with. So, I think this is a major problem, both ethically and politically, of how to really grapple with these issues going forward. And so I appreciate, all of you offering reflections on those topics.
Yeah, and I think that's a great way to wrap up, Vincent, because in reality, I don't think both you and George were like, well, what are we going to discuss and where are we going with this? And I think my goal is ultimately to have this discussion about science. And I think it was largely framed also around Marxism and a background that we share, and questions we have about that. But what comes from this for me is like, in the coming weeks or months, if there's something that you, Vincent, or George, you're like, hey, I want to bring this to What's Left and talk about it. That's what I'd hope would happen. We say at the end of our sign off, it's like, if there's things you want to discuss, contact us and things like that. And we mean that, and that's what George did. He contacted me, and then we started a discussion. And so that last thing you said, hey, I'd like to discuss this later. You should do that. Just let us know, like, hey, this is my idea. Could we get on, in December or January or whenever, and just have this discussion about this. This really, for me, is what's best about this show. For me, is meeting people and talking to people, and to have an ongoing relationship about things that interest me, but also that interest you or George or Kenny, because some of those things are things I'm not thinking about, that I need to be thinking about. So I just would say, both George and Vincent, thank you for taking this time. But also, I'm really hoping you see this now as a space, like a workshop that you can collaborate in the future as well.
Sounds good. Thanks for having us on.
Excellent.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. So let me do the sign off here. All right. That does it for this week's episode. What's Left is a weekly political podcast channel challenging the mainstream left. We post information about our topics and our guests on the episode notes, wherever you found this episode, or on our blog, whatsleftpodcast.com. You can find past episodes of this podcast channel there and connect with us. I remind folks, if you like anything you have heard here, please subscribe, rate, review, or turn on your notifications to any of our 8 platforms: Spotify, iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, Bitchute, Odysee, Rumble, YouTube. Oh, we're not on Stitcher, so you can't reach Stitcher anymore. Stitcher doesn't exist, so Stitcher is not one of them, or Telegram. If you would like to give us feedback about something you heard or suggest something for us to cover, contact us through our blog, just like George did, so you can see what happens when you do that. You can find our blog and any of those links on the episode notes, wherever you found this episode. So George, Vincent, thank you very much. Kenny, it's great to have you here again, and we'll see you all next week.
When you agreed to abjure one popular item of your doctrine in 33, I should have known. You were just withdrawing from a hopeless political brawl in order to further the true interests of science.
Which are?
The study of the properties of motion, the mother of machines, which will make the earth so good to live on, we shall have no need of heaven. In science, only one thing counts: contribution to knowledge. And you have contributed more than any man in 100 years.
Have I? Contributed for whom? Welcome to my gutter, brother scientist and fellow traitor. I sold out. You're a buyer. The first sight of the book. The mouth waters, the curses are drowned. Hallowed be our bargaining, whitewashing, death-fearing community.
Science is not concerned with our personal weakness.
No, my dear Sarti, even in my present situation, I may still be able to give you a few pointers about science. In my spare time, and I've got plenty of that, I've gone over my case. The pursuit of science calls for particular courage. It deals in knowledge distilled from doubt. Our new art of doubting delighted the people. They tore the telescope out of our hands and turned it on their tormentors. Princes, landowners, priests. These men felt the cold eye of science being turned on an age-old poverty that could clearly be got rid of if only they were got rid of themselves. So we are deluged with threats and bribes. But can we cut ourselves off from the people and still remain scientists? The battle to measure the heavens is won by doubt. By credulity, the Roman housewife's battle for milk will be lost again and again. Science, Artie, is involved in both struggles. What are you scientists working for? The sole aim of science, to my mind, is to lighten the toil of a human existence. If you give way to coercion, your progress must be a progress away from humanity. The gulf between you and humanity might grow so wide that the response to your exaltation at some new achievement could be a universal howl of horror. As a scientist, I had a unique opportunity. In my day, astronomy emerged into the marketplace. At that particular time, if one man had put up a fight, it might have had vast repercussions. I've come to the conclusion, Sati, that I was never in real danger. For a time, I was as strong as the authorities, and I surrendered my knowledge to the powers that be to use it, not use it, abuse it, just as they saw fit.